Hello and welcome to another episode of Earth 911 Sustainability in Your Ear. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe, and we're back with another innovator interview, a conversation about a couple of different op-ed pieces that have appeared in Newsweek and the Washington Post over the past few weeks that were authored by Rick Parnell, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Foundation for Climate Restoration, with two co-writers. One was Sir David King, who is at the Center for Climate Repair at Cambridge, and the other, Kathleen Rogers, who's the president and CEO of the Earth Day Foundation. Both incredibly influential folks that Rick wrote these editorials with. And we wanted to go through some of the calls for action. Now, we recently had Dr. Erica Dodds, the Chief Operating Officer of the Foundation for Climate Restoration, on the show. But these are really important ideas, and we wanted to get Rick on to talk about them. Let me just run down a couple of things. And first, let me call out, by the way, I'm a financial supporter of the foundation personally, so I do believe this is a very important topic. Rick's Washington Post editorial started out by pointing out the fact that we are going to see 250,000 additional deaths per year between 2030 and 2050 from climate-related health issues. And additionally, after 2050, there's a projection that we'll see as many as 529,000 deaths a year from climate-caused food shortages. Now, what the Foundation for Climate Restoration is calling for is investment and subsidies for carbon dioxide removal technology, sometimes called CDR. And a lot of people, including Earth 911, have written about direct air capture, a form of carbon dioxide removal. And we wanted to get Rick on to share some of his ideas. Rick, welcome to the show. How are you today?
I am great, Mitch. Thank you for having me. And thank you for your support of the foundation.
Well, it's been important. And since Peter Fikowski first introduced me to this idea a few years ago, I have become more convinced that this is an essential component of a multi-pronged strategy to address climate change. So first, could you just share your thoughts about why carbon dioxide removal technology is important now, before we have begun to really lower our overall emissions? Why do we need CDR today?
Well, I've been in the climate space for, I used to call it the climate wars for the last 20 years. And I say that climate wars because there's so much debate on what to do now, what to do later, 1.5, 2 degrees. We've seen all of that. But the thing that we really don't see people talking about is that even if we get to, and I'm confident that now more than ever, people are committed to this, but even if we get to net zero in 2050 or somewhere around 2050, 95% of the legacy carbon is still in the atmosphere.
Right.
So, what people don't talk about is that we will be in the same place we are now with the weather patterns and the storms and the fires and all the stuff that we're seeing if we don't work to get rid of the carbon. And, for me, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. We can do all of what many companies and others are committed to in governments to get to net zero. But we can also do carbon removal. Let's start now, or we've already started, but let's grow the industry in the space now and work on this over the next 30 years.
Well, what does it take to grow the industry, since you called that out?
Yeah, I think a few things. One, we need more investment, but investment needs to have stimulation. So hopefully a little bit more government policy and maybe a price on carbon and research. That's a big thing. Is that people, when I talk to people about climate restoration, and we talk about getting back to pre-industrial levels, it really resonates. And of course, when I talk about the 95%, it's a wake-up call. But climate restoration and returning to pre-industrial carbon levels, people understand, and it really resonates. And it's a positive message about humanity got us here, humanity can get us out of this. But what people then have a little bit of apprehension about is, well, what are some of these solutions? Are they geoengineering? And what are the risks? And so I think that one of the biggest things that we need is research. We need to be able to say, like Bill Gates talks about all these different kinds of solutions that are possible and nascent and on the horizon. Some will fail, some will succeed wildly, but we need to invest in the research to test some of these different potential solutions. That to me is one of the biggest pieces.
And if we don't try, including all the mistakes, which some people will call a waste of money, but are simply the fact that we have to work this out, we're not going to get anywhere. We can reduce our carbon, like you said, but we are going to be stuck with this legacy carbon just hanging in the atmosphere and continuing to warm things. Now, you mentioned putting a price on carbon a moment ago. This week, the Biden administration announced that they have set a price, at least in terms of policy aspirations, of around $51 per metric ton. And I know that CDR technology has reached about an $80 a ton removal cost at this point, in the best case. Is $51 too low, and do they need to adjust that upward?
I think $51 is a good target. I think it's a start. I think there's going to be a lot of negotiations around this, but I think it's a great start.
And, the other thing about this is that $80 a ton cost can be recouped in a variety of ways. That material can be turned into cement. It could potentially be transformed into a form of fuel. So there's money to be made in addition to the
exact
carbon, right?
Yep.
Now, what have you learned from the very distinct change in CO2 levels that we saw during the COVID crisis? Do you think that society has learned they could really reduce their emissions, and do you think government's aligned with that?
Well, I think that there's a couple of things that we've all learned through the COVID. One, we could reduce emissions, but look at what we would have to do to get there in our current construct of essentially shutting down all these different economies. And so it's kind of not a really fair measurement. What I think we have learned is that when governments are pushed to shove, they can't act. Look at the trillions of dollars that we put into stimulus and into recovery, and look at how fast we have this vaccine. I mean, who would have thought? So, and it also comes down to leadership. Who would have thought that we would see Pfizer and Merck coming together to work together on the vaccine? And that is, through Biden's leadership. Look at the goalpost for the vaccine. We started with maybe by the end of the year, most Americans will start with the U.S. Most Americans will be vaccinated, probably into 2022. And then it was maybe by fall, and then it was July. And just this week, it's by the end of May, we will have enough vaccines, hopefully in the arms of all Americans. That's game changing.
Yeah.
Not only for the planning that we're all able to do and be able to say, look at what we can do, what will COP26 look like now that we know that so many people will be vaccinated. But more importantly, it's when, and this is something that I truly believe in and why I like climate restoration, when humanity decides that they're going to work on something, massive change can happen.
So let me ask you a general question. Do you consider carbon dioxide removal sort of a silver bullet in the climate change battle?
No, I do not. I don't believe in silver bullets. I think that this is absolutely going to be a tapestry of different solutions. I think that it is absolutely a part of the mix. But, many people have said to me, is climate restoration and our focus on carbon removal, is that instead of mitigation adaptation? Absolutely not. It's complementary. It's the third leg of the stool.
What are the other two legs?
Mitigation and adaptation.
And can you go into a little detail? So what is adaptation, for instance?
Yeah, I mean, I think, sort of if you think in terms of we have a really good video on our website if anybody wants to take a look at it, f4cr.org, but it's the bathtub analogy. And ironically, Bill Gates uses it in his book. But the idea that if the bathtub is overflowing, the Earth is sitting in a bathtub of overflowing carbon, we have to do mitigation and turn off the faucet, but we have to do adaptation as well as how do we live in this environment? What are some of the different solutions? What are, everything from the sea level rise and how they're, adapting to it in Venice with some of the different seawalls and those kinds of things. Those things are going to have to happen, and they're critical, especially for island states. Yeah. But getting to restoration, the third leg is finishing the job.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's talk a little more about where the CO2 captured from the atmosphere can be stored. Now, we know that there's currently a lot of underground storage, and folks are starting to experiment with marine permaculture, essentially seeding kelp fields so that with CO2 captured from the atmosphere, so that it is used by the plants, but then sinks to the bottom of the ocean. Where do you see the use of the recovered CO2 going? Is it going to be fuel stock for other things. One of the ways that I describe CDR is that it's mining the atmosphere, literally pulling carbon out of the atmosphere, which can be used for fuel, for cement, as I mentioned before. What is the layout of a carbon capture economy in terms of where the carbon goes?
Yeah. So as you mentioned, when it comes to building materials, there's 40 companies plus globally right now that are working, actively working in the carbon removal, building material solutions, concrete, a little bit nascent steel, and some of the others. That is emerging now. If you think in terms of the building material industry, it's just trillion. I think it's a $30 trillion, something like that. Industry globally. So you think of the potential there for storing and building materials. That's one. Two, I am quite, this is not a market piece, but I'm quite taken with some of the work that Oceans Visions, for example, one of our colleagues is working on with, as you mentioned, with kelp, the ability to do these kelp builds and then have carbon sinks at the bottom of the ocean that'll last for 1,000 years. That doesn't turn a profit, but there's all kinds of uses for kelp that do, from everything from feed material for livestock to beauty products. But I think increasingly, I think that these are not markets that I'm about to talk about that are huge, but you're everything from, I'm wearing shoes right now that are made from carbon negative materials. There's carbon negative vodka. There's all kinds of different things that are coming online. Those are not going to solve the problem, but they are going to help socialize the idea of carbon removal, that look for products, look for ways to support the industry. I think that investors like Bill Gates and others that are at the tip of the spear, investing in some of these solutions, some will fail, some will succeed. But I think that tapping into these investor networks, increasingly you're seeing investors taking on carbon removal. And if I could, let me just say something about that.
Sure.
Imagine if companies are racing, and I think rightfully, because of starting with the youth, but the social agenda around climate, it's really, really taking hold. And companies are racing to raise their hand and say, we want to be net neutral by 2050, and we're going to buy offsets and all of that. Imagine, which is phenomenal, but imagine if companies said, okay, for every dollar, 10 cents on that dollar, I'm going to diversify my portfolio and invest in carbon removal credits, not just carbon offset credits.
Right.
How that would drive that market and provide potentially funding for entrepreneurs that are looking at new solutions. And not the least of which is, imagine if we could create a fund that would help farmers. One of the greatest potentials of carbon sequestration is through soil management. So I think there's just a lot of opportunity there.
And we really have not, as your point early in the conversation, done enough research to understand all the ways this can be applied. Analogously, in 1840, 1850, or when John D. Rockefeller was dipping petroleum out of Pennsylvania puddles of oil, we didn't have any idea about all the ways that we would be using petrochemicals 100 years in the future. And when we talk about this, most people talk about it in terms of direct costs, like, oh, we're going to put $1.9 trillion into a Green New Deal. That is perceived only as expense rather than an investment. And you're pointing out an important element, which is this is an investment these companies can make in order to be more competitive in the future. How much do you anticipate we need to invest as a society annually, starting in 2021, to achieve the goal that the foundation has to start to reverse climate change sometime in the 2040s?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the floor that we have, many of our colleagues have talked about is $50 billion, and then it goes up into the stratosphere from there. So I don't have a locked in number, but I think it's at least $50 billion, which on one hand seems like a lot of money, but on the other, it's not. But I wanted to pick up on your point about, it's interesting because I'm a history guy. Rockefeller, when he was doing the development of Standard Oil, I don't believe that if corporate leaders back then knew what they were doing to the environment, that we would have been on that path. So I think that the boardrooms and the C-suites today have woken up to wait. This is part of our responsibility to look for these kinds of solutions, like carbon removal and carbon removal offsets or credits, to do our part. So I think there's been a massive awakening and the corporate and the boardroom level, and it just continue, not everywhere, but I continue to think that we should encourage that and do a shout out. I'm a big believer that you should change companies and policies from within. So, get in, vote your proxy, get your company to make investments in these different kinds of solutions.
Now, you spent 20 years at the United Nations Foundation before you came over to the Foundation for Climate Restoration. Obviously, you've been working with public-private partnerships for a long time, and $50 billion a year really isn't very much money. There were more than $600 billion in green bonds issued last year. So there's plenty of cash out there that could be dedicated to doing this. Do you see more dialogue right now amongst companies and between companies and governments about how they can make these advances together?
Yeah, I think we do. I think we see leadership from companies like Microsoft and Stripe and others that are making commitments and looking for solutions. And, we have a partnership that we are co-founders on. It's the Carbon Removal Task Force that has governments, companies, NGOs, youth movements, all working together on what do these solutions look like? What are the policies that need to change? How can we help companies find their way through all of this? I think there is genuine misunderstanding, confusion, and absolute willingness. I thought what Microsoft did was really brave to say, we're going to remove our carbon footprint back to the 1977, I think it is. But we don't know how. I think that's the exact right kind of attitude of let's all figure this out together and experiment. So I think you're going to see more and more of companies collaborating on this.
Now, let me ask a related question. There was a lot of dialogue about including in the current stimulus bill, which is going through Congress right now, some incentives around green investment. Not a lot of that appears to be going through, but what additional steps would you like to see from the Biden administration to incent this kind of research and the business investment you're talking about?
Well, you saw in my Newsweek piece with Kathleen Rogers, president of Earth Day Network, is that I think there's a real opportunity. Biden is the restoration president, no question in my mind. Restore dignity, restore leadership, restore U.S. leadership in the world, and restore science and trust. And I think that he has the opportunity to be the president that says, I want to restore the climate and get us on a path. To that end, I think that the $6 billion allocation for climate research that was in the previous package is a start. I think that imagine what the federal government broadly, including the Pentagon, could do in their procurement power. If you could look at the federal government's footprint as carbon negative construction over the next 10 to 20 years, it's a game changer.
Sure. And it changes the economics for everybody else when the largest customer in the world makes that kind of switch.
Absolutely.
Now, tell us a little more about the Foundation for Climate Restoration. You have a variety of programs. You have local chapters. You've got a youth program that's really inspiring. How can people get involved, and what should you recommend that one of our listeners do to start a journey toward understanding CDR?
So for the Foundation for Climate Restoration, our belief is that we are building with partners an ecosystem for climate restoration. And what that means is that we have a variety of initiatives, as you pointed out. We do youth training. We have local clubs. We have a partnership. It's a faith partnership that includes the Vatican and others. We have the Carbon Removal Task Force partnership. We have several different convenings. We have a strategy on Road to Glasgow. And that is that when leaders meet over this next year, whether it's G20, pre-COP, UNGA, World Economic Forum, climate restoration should be on the agenda. And the point of all that is that our belief is that wherever you are, if you're in the pew, if you're in school, if you're at work, if you're an employer, employee, and most importantly, if you are a voter, you should be using your voice to call for climate restoration. Again, all in a complete positive way. And what people can do is start a club locally. We will help you with that. We have the toolkits on our website. Ask your local, local governments is a big strategy that we're working on towards COP26. Ask your local government to become a climate restoration government. We did this with Dave Cortese in California, and he made Santa Clara County the first climate restoration local government in the world. And now we have local governments globally that are starting to take this on. And what that means is change your planning, change your procurement, use your local procurement power to call for building materials that are carbon negative. So, and use your voice locally, use your voice nationally. But if you're a youth, we have youth programs we can introduce you to. We also work with Girl Up, which is in more than 100 countries. We can introduce you there. We work with Earth Day Network. So, get involved, and there's multiples of ways, and we would love to help you.
Well, we've talked with several of the scientists who are contributing to the UN reports that precede the COP26 meetings in November. And consistently, they're very optimistic about our opportunity to change direction. But everyone agrees that 2021 is the pivotal year. What is your feeling about where we'll be in 2030? This is kind of a generic question we're asking everybody these days, but can you kind of share a vision of how far along the path you expect we will be?
Yeah, I'll tell you that people hear me say this all the time. For the Foundation for Climate Restoration, I hope we're out of business, because I hope that we are so successful in helping to build this ecosystem that humanity is on a path and there's no turning back. As far as, one of the things that we're trying to do right now is work on some modeling, and we hope that we could have that done by the end of the year, but some modeling on what would it take for potentially less storms in 2035 and 3040 or 40 and 45 if we are on track for climate restoration. So if we could have the 10% investments in carbon removal credits up and running by the end of the year or early next year, and grow that annually at something like a 10%. If we could continue to have the beginnings of research around some of these solutions, if we could get the IPCC to call on to call for a special report on climate restoration and what does it mean to scale carbon removal, that would be a huge win. I will say, as far as COP26, as you point out, I think this has the potential to be the next Paris. And I say that not necessarily in the negotiations themselves, but I think that we are being held accountable by youth, by movements. I think that the private sector for sure, I think that this will be a very different COP. And I think that there will be a sense of we won't be post-COVID, let me be clear. I understand that, but I think that this sort of the post feeling trapped by COVID, that COP will be the first global convening that there's a potential that so many people will be able to show up physically and of course virtually, but be able to say it's time for us to take a new direction. I have great faith in this COP.
Well, we share that faith and the optimism that you do. Rick, I want to thank you for taking some time to talk with us today.
Thank you so much, Mitch.
Folks, that was Rick Parnell. He's the Chief Executive Officer of the Foundation for Climate Restoration. And you can find them at foundationforclimaterestoration.org. That's one big, long word, foundationforclimaterestoration.org. Check them out and take the time to learn about what you can do in your local communities. We're going to be doing that here in the Tacoma, Washington area. So we encourage you to get involved and start this movement towards carbon dioxide removal. This is Earth 911 Sustainability in Your Ear, and I'm Mitch Ratcliffe. We will be back with another episode soon. In the meantime, take care of yourself. Let's take care of one another and the planet. We'll see you soon.